He was on his way to propose to another woman, convinced that his past had been left behind forever. One traffic light, one glance toward a park, and his perfectly constructed life began to crack. Sometimes fate needs only a few seconds to remind you of what you once ran from. This story is completely created and written by the author of the channel. If you're curious to find out how it ends, please support the author with a like and a subscription. Ethan Harris sat in the back seat of his black luxury car as it moved smoothly through the evening traffic, the city lights stretching into long reflections across the windshield. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, the familiar weight of expensive fabric grounding him in a life he had built piece by piece. His brown hair was perfectly styled, his expression calm, almost detached, and his brown eyes looked forward without really seeing the road. Everything about this night had been planned, calculated, and approved by logic long before emotions had any chance to interfere. In the inner pocket of his jacket lay a small velvet box. He had checked its presence more than once, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. Control was his nature. Inside the box was a ring chosen carefully, not for passion, but for symbolism. It represented stability, the next correct step, the kind of decision that looked good on paper and made sense to everyone around him. The woman waiting for him tonight was kind, elegant, and perfectly suited to the life he led. With her, there would be no surprises, no painful memories, no parts of himself he had worked so hard to forget. Ethan told himself this was what maturity looked like. Love, in his understanding, was no longer fire or risk, but balance and comfort. The past belonged to another version of him, a younger man who had believed feelings could be enough to build a future. That man had learned the hard way that emotions were unpredictable and dangerous. Success had taught him discipline, and discipline had taught him how to survive. As the car slowed near an intersection, Ethan glanced absently out the window. The city blurred by, familiar and unremarkable, until something pulled his attention toward the park on the corner. It was not the park itself, but a figure standing near the entrance, framed by the soft glow of streetlights. A woman with brown hair stood there, holding a small child in her arms. The sight struck him with a force he could not explain, his breath catching before his mind could catch up. The car came to a stop at the red light, but Ethan no longer noticed the sound of traffic or the low hum of the engine. His gaze locked onto the scene outside, his heart beginning to pound in a way that felt foreign and deeply unsettling. Somewhere deep inside him, a feeling stirred that he had buried years ago, a quiet warning that the carefully ordered life he believed in was about to fracture. This story is fictional and entirely created and written by the author of the channel. Ethan could not look away. The longer he stared through the tinted glass, the more unreal the moment felt, as if his mind was playing a cruel trick on him. The woman near the park shifted the child slightly in her arms, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face with a familiar, unconscious gesture that sent a sharp wave of recognition through him. His chest tightened, and for a second he considered the possibility that exhaustion had finally caught up with him, that he was seeing echoes of a past he had never truly let go. But the child moved, turning her head toward the street, and the illusion shattered. The little girl's face was lit by the streetlight, revealing features that struck Ethan with devastating clarity. The shape of her eyes, the line of her brows, the quiet seriousness beneath her innocent expression all mirrored his own reflection from childhood photographs he had not looked at in years. A cold rush swept through him, followed by a heat that climbed up his spine, leaving him frozen between disbelief and dread. The woman laughed softly at something the girl did, and the sound carried faintly through the glass, awakening memories Ethan had long suppressed. He remembered late evenings spent talking on worn couches, shared dreams spoken in whispers, and a time when he believed love alone could carry him forward. He knew that laugh. He knew the way she tilted her head when she smiled, the gentle patience in her movements. There was no longer any doubt. It was Claire, His thoughts spiraled backward, pulling him into memories he had carefully locked away. He saw her as she had been years ago, standing in a small kitchen, hands trembling as she told him news he had not been ready to hear. He remembered the fear that had seized him then, the panic that his carefully laid plans might collapse under the weight of responsibility. Instead of listening, he had retreated behind logic and ambition, convincing himself that walking away was temporary, that time would smooth everything over. The traffic light remained red, yet the world outside felt suspended, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Ethan's driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions, but Ethan could not speak. His mind was racing, trying to build explanations, trying to deny what felt increasingly undeniable. If the child was his, then everything he believed about his past was wrong. If Claire had stood in front of him all those years ago carrying a truth he refused to face, then his success was built on a foundation of silence. The girl rested her head against Claire's shoulder, her small hand gripping the fabric of her mother's shirt, and the intimacy of the gesture struck Ethan harder than anything else. He realized with a painful clarity that entire years had passed without him, years filled with first words, first steps, and quiet moments he would never get back. The ring in his pocket suddenly felt heavy, almost absurd, as if it belonged to a life that no longer made sense. The light was about to change, and Ethan knew that in a matter of seconds the car would move forward, carrying him away from the park and the truth standing just beyond the glass. Yet something inside him refused to let that happen. For the first time in many years, fear was no longer something he could outrun, and the past was no longer willing to remain a shadow. The car finally rolled forward, but Ethan felt as if he were moving in the opposite direction, pulled backward by a force stronger than momentum. His driver asked quietly whether they should continue, and for a moment Ethan could not answer. His gaze remained fixed on the side mirror, watching the park recede into the distance, the figures growing smaller until they blended into the evening crowd. Yet the image had already burned itself into his mind, refusing to fade no matter how far the car carried him. As the city lights blurred past, memories he had buried under years of discipline and success began to surface with unsettling clarity. He remembered the version of himself who had believed that love could wait, that responsibility could be postponed without consequence. Claire's face appeared again and again in his thoughts, not as she was now, but as she had been then, standing in front of him with uncertainty in her eyes and hope she was afraid to name. He remembered how quickly he had shut that door, choosing certainty over courage. Ethan's mind returned to the moment she had told him she was pregnant, the words delivered softly, almost cautiously, as if she feared they might break something fragile between them. He had heard only danger in her confession, not the trust it represented. His response had been careful and restrained, filled with reasons that sounded sensible but lacked compassion. He had spoken about timing, about pressure, about how everything was happening too fast, never realizing that in doing so he was teaching her that his ambitions mattered more than her future. The silence that followed her departure had been easy for him to accept at first. Work filled every gap, every quiet moment that might have invited reflection. He convinced himself that Claire had made her choice, that if there had been anything more to say, she would have said it. That belief had allowed him to move forward without looking back, to build a life that appeared complete from the outside. Now, that certainty was unraveling. The child's face lingered in his thoughts, raising questions he could no longer ignore. If Claire had left carrying his child, then the silence he relied on was not peace, but avoidance. The realization settled heavily in his chest, bringing with it a sharp sense of regret that success could not dull. The car slowed as they approached his destination, but Ethan felt no urgency to arrive. The ring in his pocket seemed to press against him, a reminder of the future he was supposed to want. Yet the image of the girl in the white dress refused to release its grip on him, demanding answers he was no longer willing to postpone. For the first time in years, Ethan understood that some truths cannot be outrun, no matter how fast you drive away from them. Ethan did not make it to his destination. Somewhere between intention and arrival, something inside him shifted, forcing a decision he could no longer delay. He told the driver to turn around, his voice calm but firm, as if afraid that hesitation might allow doubt to return. The city unfolded in reverse, familiar streets leading him back toward the park, toward the moment he had tried and failed to escape. With every passing second, his thoughts grew heavier, crowded with questions he had avoided for years. When the car stopped near the park again, the street lights had grown brighter against the darkening sky. Claire was still there, slowly walking along the path, the child resting against her shoulder, clearly tired. Ethan stepped out of the car, the sound of the door closing behind him startlingly loud in the quiet evening. For a brief moment, he simply stood there, unsure whether he had the right to cross the distance between them after so much time had passed. Claire noticed him almost immediately. Her steps slowed, and then stopped altogether. Surprise flashed across her face, quickly replaced by something more guarded, something shaped by years of carrying responsibility alone. She did not smile, but she did not turn away either. The child lifted her head, curious eyes studying the unfamiliar man approaching them. Ethan felt the weight of every unsaid word as he drew closer. When he finally spoke her name, it sounded strange in his mouth, like a language he had once known but forgotten how to use. Claire answered quietly, acknowledging him without warmth or hostility, her tone shaped by caution rather than bitterness. He realized then that whatever they had once been, this moment belonged to a different version of them both. The girl shifted in Claire's arms, studying Ethan with open curiosity. Her gaze held no fear, only a natural interest that cut deeper than any accusation could have. Ethan lowered himself slightly, meeting her at eye level, noticing the familiar intensity in her brown eyes. The resemblance was undeniable now, no longer filtered through glass or distance, and the reality of it sent a tremor through him he could not hide. Claire broke the silence by introducing the child, her voice steady despite the tension between them. She said her name, Emily, and explained her age with a simplicity that contrasted sharply with the storm inside Ethan's mind. He listened, nodding slowly, aware that every detail mattered more than anything he had discussed in boardrooms or negotiations. He did not accuse or demand explanations. Instead, he asked the question that had been burning inside him since the moment he saw them. Claire's response was quiet but firm, shaped by years of acceptance rather than resentment. She told him she had done what she believed was right at the time, choosing stability over uncertainty, and protecting her child from a future filled with hesitation. As they stood there beneath the streetlights, the world around them continued as usual, unaware that something irreversible was unfolding. Ethan understood that this was no longer about what he wanted or planned. It was about a truth that had waited patiently for him to be ready to face it, and now that he was standing before it, there was no turning back. The conversation did not end there, though either of them seemed ready for it to continue. Claire suggested they sit on a nearby bench, more for Emily's comfort than for her own, and Ethan followed without argument. The child slipped from her mother's arms and stood between them for a moment, holding Claire's hand while observing Ethan with careful curiosity. He noticed how naturally she stayed close to her mother, as if the world had taught her early where safety lived. Claire began to speak slowly, choosing her words with care, as if each sentence carried weight she had learned not to waste. She told him about the years that followed her departure, about the uncertainty and fear she had felt when she realized she would be raising a child alone. She described small apartments, long shifts, and nights when exhaustion left her barely standing, yet she never allowed herself to regret her choice. Every sacrifice, she explained, was made with Emily in mind. Ethan listened in silence, his attention fixed on the sound of her voice rather than the park around them. He learned how Claire had worked multiple jobs at once, how she had balanced responsibility and love with little support, and how she had learned to be strong not because she wanted to be, but because she had no other option. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a calm acceptance of the life she had built out of necessity. Emily climbed onto the bench beside her mother and began swinging her legs, humming softly to herself. Ethan watched her movements, noticing the way she furrowed her brow in concentration, the same way he did when deep in thought. The realization struck him again, sharper this time, that he had missed years he could never reclaim. Birthdays, first words, scraped knees, and bedtime stories had all happened without him. Claire explained that she had never planned to find him again. Their meeting that evening was not intentional, but it had forced her to confront a truth she had been carrying alone. Emily had begun asking questions, simple ones that were difficult to answer, about why her family looked different from others. Claire admitted that she could no longer ignore those questions, nor could she continue pretending that the past did not exist. Ethan felt the pressure build in his chest as he absorbed everything she said. For the first time, his success felt distant and irrelevant, unable to shield him from the weight of responsibility he had unknowingly abandoned. He did not interrupt or defend himself, knowing that explanations would sound hollow in the face of lived experience. When Claire finished speaking, the silence between them was heavy but no longer hostile. Ethan understood that this was not a moment that could be fixed with words or promises. It was the beginning of something far more difficult, a reckoning with choices made long ago and the consequences that had patiently waited for him to return. Ethan's life began to change quietly, without dramatic declarations or sudden transformations. After that evening in the park, he did not disappear again, nor did he attempt to force himself into a role he had not yet earned. Instead, he started with small, deliberate steps, showing up when Claire allowed it and respecting the boundaries she carefully set. He understood that trust was not something he could demand, especially after years of absence, and that any place he hoped to have in Emily's life would need to be built slowly. At first, his visits were brief and awkward. He would meet them in the park or walk alongside them for a few blocks, listening more than speaking, observing the rhythm of their daily lives. Emily treated him with polite curiosity, asking simple questions and offering small smiles, but always returning to her mother's side when uncertainty crept in. Ethan accepted this without protest, aware that familiarity could not be rushed and that consistency mattered more than grand gestures. The ring he had once planned to use remained untouched in its box. The woman he had intended to propose to received an honest conversation instead, one stripped of excuses and half-truths. Ending that relationship cost him the comfort of predictability, but he felt no regret. For the first time, he was no longer choosing the safest option, but the most truthful one, even if it came with discomfort and uncertainty. As weeks passed, Ethan made space in his life where none had existed before. Meetings were rescheduled, evenings left unclaimed by work, and priorities quietly rearranged. He learned Emily's favorite snacks, the songs she liked to hum, and the stories she asked to hear again and again. Each detail felt like a small victory, a fragile thread connecting him to a world he was only beginning to understand. Claire watched these changes cautiously, never rushing to trust them, but unable to ignore the effort behind them. She noticed how Ethan listened when Emily spoke, how he knelt to her level rather than speaking down to her, and how he never made promises he could not immediately keep. His presence remained steady, not dramatic, not demanding, simply there. Over time, that steadiness softened something in her that had long been guarded. For Ethan, the transformation was internal as much as external. He began to understand that being present required more than intention. It required patience, humility, and the willingness to accept that he could not reclaim the past. The guilt did not vanish, but it changed shape, becoming something that pushed him forward rather than holding him back. Each shared moment with Emily reinforced the truth that this was no longer about correcting a mistake, but about building something real from where they stood now. By the end of that season, the man who once measured his life in achievements and milestones found himself measuring time differently. Progress was no longer marked by success alone, but by trust earned one day at a time. And though nothing was settled, Ethan understood that this uncertain path was the only one that felt honest, and for the first time in years, honesty felt like enough. Time did not heal everything, but it revealed what was real. Months passed, marked by routines that slowly became familiar, and moments that no longer felt forced or fragile. Ethan was no longer a visitor in Claire and Emily's life, yet he was careful not to assume a role that had not been fully granted. He continued to show up quietly, day after day, allowing his actions to speak in the spaces where words once failed him. Emily began to change toward him in small but meaningful ways. She started waiting for him in the park, asking if he would come on certain days, and reaching for his hand without hesitation. The first time she called him by his name instead of that man, something in Ethan's chest loosened, and he had to look away to hide the emotion rising too quickly. He learned how deeply children notice consistency, how trust grows not from explanations, but from presence. Claire watched all of this with a careful heart. She had learned long ago to protect herself and her daughter from disappointment, and she was not willing to abandon that instinct easily. Still, she could not deny what she saw. Ethan did not disappear when things became inconvenient, and he did not step back when responsibility felt heavy. He stayed during illness, exhaustion, and moments when Emily tested boundaries in ways only a child could. He did not retreat when parenting proved difficult. One evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, Claire finally allowed herself to speak openly. She told Ethan that the past still lived inside her, not as anger, but as memory, and that memory made her cautious. She admitted that while she no longer doubted his intentions, she feared the pain of trusting him again. Ethan listened without interrupting, knowing that this honesty was not an accusation, but an invitation to respond with truth. He did not promise that everything would be easy or perfect. Instead, he acknowledged the damage he had caused and accepted that some wounds required time rather than reassurance. He told her that he did not expect forgiveness to arrive quickly, and that he was prepared to earn his place in their lives for as long as it took. His voice carried no desperation, only certainty, and that steadiness made his words believable. Claire did not answer him that night. She did not need to. The shift between them was quiet, subtle, but unmistakable. Something had changed, not because the past was erased, but because it no longer controlled the present. For the first time since they had reunited, the future felt like a shared space rather than a divided one. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with drama or urgency, but with quiet certainty. 2 years had passed since the evening at the park, years shaped by effort, patience, and choices made without shortcuts. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt honest, one built around shared mornings, unhurried evenings, and the simple comfort of knowing where each day would end. Ethan no longer measured time by meetings or deadlines, but by moments that mattered in ways he had once failed to understand. The park had become a constant in their lives, not as a reminder of loss, but as a place where something broken had been rebuilt piece by piece. On an ordinary afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the trees and children's laughter filled the air, Ethan walked beside Claire while Emily ran ahead, chasing leaves and calling back to make sure they were watching. There was no tension in the moment, no fear of it slipping away, only a quiet awareness of how far they had come. Ethan stopped near the same bench where so many difficult conversations had once taken place. Claire turned toward him, already sensing that something was different, though there was no alarm in her expression. Emily returned to them, slipping her small hand into Ethan's with complete trust, unaware that she had become the center of his entire world. Ethan knelt down slowly, not because he wanted to make a spectacle, but because he wanted to meet the moment with humility. He spoke without rehearsed words, his voice steady and sincere. He did not talk about fate or destiny, nor did he try to rewrite the past. He acknowledged what could never be changed and focused instead on what could still be chosen. He told Claire that he could not give her back the years she spent alone, but he could promise to be present for every day that followed. Not as a man seeking redemption, but as someone who had finally learned what commitment truly meant. Claire listened, her eyes filling not with surprise but with recognition. She saw not the man he had been, but the one he had become through patience and consistency. When she said yes, it was not a decision made in emotion, but one rooted in trust earned over time. Emily clapped her hands, laughing at the happiness she could feel even if she did not fully understand it, and wrapped her arms around both of them. In that moment, Ethan understood that the greatest turning point of his life had not been a business success or a calculated decision, but the courage to stop running and face what he once feared. The future before them was not perfect or predictable, but it was real, and it was theirs. Sometimes, life does not reward the plans you make, but the truths you finally choose to accept. The author of this channel and this story sees it not simply as a romantic drama, but as a story about growing up, responsibility, and the price of choices made. It is a story about how easy it is to make a decision when you are only thinking about the future, and how difficult it is to face the consequences of the past. The main character does not walk a path of redemption, but of awareness, coming to understand that true strength lies not in control or success, but in the ability to stay when it truly matters. From the author's perspective, this story shows that love does not always return immediately, and does not always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it requires time, patience, and the willingness to change without making loud promises. The happy ending is not accidental or idealized, it is earned through actions, consistency, and inner growth. Subscribe to the channel and rate this story on a scale from 1 to 10.